Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here today to see the audience here. Wonderful show. Also to be with my colleagues to speak about a very important topic. I've been doing research in the agricultural sector for most of my academic career. And what I'm going to try to do today is talk to you just broadly about climate and agriculture, but try to tie it back to some what I think are producer, society, and even some policy-related responses and actions that we have out there in front of us. The very first thing about climate and agriculture, I mean, I think everybody understands this, that we need to know some things from today's and history's experience and how that carries into the future so we can manage our agricultural enterprises. First one is that we know that our production today takes place under a climate that allows us to establish crops, have full growth and maturity, and produce a crop that will work for us. How will that continue, or how will it be altered? We've heard a little bit about that from Phil and Ryan. But we also need to know about what happens if changes in the amount of heat we have available for our crops or amount of rainfall or precipitation. Currently today it meets needs in most cases, but how will that be altered in the future in terms of our production characteristics? And then lastly, the whole issue of climate variability and how it ties back into what we are experiencing. We have sufficient regularity in most of our crop systems today to be able to manage around that. But if we look into the future, will climate variability become more impactful than actual changes in the average? It very easily could be, because that determines the economic and environmental kind of feasibility, sustainability issues that we have within agribusinesses. So if we look at the overall impacts in terms of climate change, they vary depending on if you're looking at broadacre crops, things such as corn or wheat or soybeans or rice. Very different type of crop response overall, because these have wider geographic and wider climatic envelopes that they can grow in. If we look at specialty crops such as coffee or cacao to make chocolate, or wine grapes, or pineapples, or any number of dozens of specialty crops, have very fine climate niches that changes on the order of 1 degree or maybe 2 at the most could completely change the nature of whether or not you can produce those crops. And we've already seen from some of the earlier graphs that changes on the order of 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees are what are kind of projected out there for us. I wanted to take us to the state of Oregon. Oregon has a huge agricultural diversity. We grow over 220 different agricultural commodities in our state, and we are number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in dozens of crops that we grow, and I thought I'd show you a few of them. Number 1, it's a little hard to see up there, but Christmas trees. Number 2, hazelnuts. We're number 1 in the country and number 2 in the world. We're 1, 2, 3 for many different types of grass seeds. We're number 3 for red cherries. We're number 2 for plums. We're number 3 for nursery crops. We're number 2 in the country for onions. We're number 1 for a mix of herbs that we use for many different uses. We're number 2 in hops. We're number 4 in potatoes. We're number 3 in pears. It's not a crop, but still we're number 1 in crab, Dungeness crab. And impacts that happen relative to agriculture can also affect what we do in aquaculture too. We have numerous berries that we're number 1, 2, 3, 4 in terms of production. We're also number 1, of course, in marionberries. And then, of course, wine grapes. We're either number 4 or 5, depending on the year in terms of production. And many of these are a mix of broadacre and specialty crops. And most of our production is really tied into a lot of these very unique specialty crops that we have. If we move ourselves down to the Rogue Valley, looking at Josephine, Jackson County together, we have approximately 2,500 farms. This data came from the 2012 Agricultural Survey, and it's probably a little bit different than that now, but roughly about 250,000 acres planted to crops in our region, and has probably a value of over $100 million today. The top crops we have in our 2-state area, or 2-county area, are pears, wine grapes, forage crops, wheat, sugar beet seeds, and corn. This again is a mix of broadacre and specialty crops in terms of production, so climate impacts are going to be a little different there. These producers are everything from vegetable, berry, fresh flower, forage crop, animal product producers, grain, tree fruits, tree nuts, wine grapes, and nursery products. So we have a wide-ranging agricultural sector here in our region. This is just a diagram. I want to try to put it in perspective relative to what the real issues are. If we put any number of climate metrics on an x-axis, and then we put some kind of production and or quality metrics of a given agricultural crop on the y-axis, the relationship between climate and a crop is pretty straightforward. It's parabolic. We know that if the climate's too cold somewhere along the way for hops or pears or wine grapes or plums or berries of any kind, we know that there's a place that's too cold. Either this growing season's too cold or the location is too cold for that to produce. We also know that there's a place that typically is too hot. Too warm of a climate could end up making overripe whatever product that is growing there. Yields are questionable and quality is questionable. So we have this optimum zone in there where agricultural productivity is economically and environmentally sustainable. And what we need to know today is how do these thresholds shift in a changing climate? We could look at them as being kind of multi-shifting. Oh, wonderful. I have to tell you a story. I can't see most of you right now. Ah, wonderful. My wife just got here with my glasses. I texted her earlier saying, please, please. So thank you. Wow, this is just so much better. Oh, wow, now I have to recover. So we have these thresholds between what's too cold and too hot. And if we look at this kind of boundary issue, what we know today from most crops is that they're fairly finite unless we can understand how that system functions. And the issue, I think, comes down to how do the climate systems adapt to climate in and of themselves, their plasticity, whether it be a given crop or how the crop is managed relative to what we're doing. Can we understand and manage that adaptation over time? I think we can, but we have to be able to be ready in understanding how each crop reacts to climate. So a couple of different things. I'm just going to go through some basic issues that are out there. One of them is spatial changes in agriculture. We did some work a while ago looking at wine grapes, and the image here basically shows that if you look at history, wine grapes have historically been kind of a central to north coast of California and then up into northern Oregon and into Washington kind of framework. But if you look at the changes in the future, it basically moves or shifts that to the north, higher in elevation and closer to the coast. And of course, different crops will shift as well. We also know that the changes that potentially will happen over time are going to be really dependent upon the rate and magnitude of the changes in temperature and soil moisture, as Eric mentioned earlier. If we look at irrigation, I know Eric talked about this just a little bit, and you'll talk about it over the next day and a half as well. Availability in the key summer months is really a key for our region here. If we have another dry year or two, we're going to be real challenged to produce in the coming years. But loss of snowpack and the timing of those flows are very important. Warmer conditions also increase evapotranspiration, of course. There may be some relative changes in humidity that could balance that out, but not likely in our dry climate in the summertime. We also know that the whole irrigation infrastructure is an issue because as we change our needs, we're going to change our pumping cost as well. And we also have very inefficient methods of irrigation, which I know is being addressed now in terms of the WISE project, but we really need to look at that as a major issue for agriculture. If we look at extreme events, Phil mentioned this a little bit in his talk as well. We know that there's a changing frequency of the statistics, so to speak, of what used to be maybe a 50-year drought, statistically is moving more to a 10 or a 20-year drought. So it's just more frequent in terms of the potential impact. We also know that we've seen fewer frost days or fewer maybe winter extremes. The problem I see here with this is, and it's actually shown out quite a bit in different places in the world, that what happens is that if the crop system and the human system get used to having less winter freeze or frost, and then we all of a sudden get one because they're not going to go away, we tend to be more impacted because we're not ready. So it's all about the resilience of the system. We also know that precipitation has tended to move to higher frequent heavy rainfall events than being spread out more across the season. So we're just getting a shift in terms of how that rainfall or even snowfall comes to us. If we looked at disease and pests, a large number of things, I can't go into all the details with this here, but we know that observations and models indicate that we're going to see shifts in some diseases, pests, depending on location, and maybe even some decreases in others. But wherever there's a decrease, there'll be a niche opened up for something new to come in that will likely be a problem. We know, for example, for many orchard fruits and vineyard growers that spider mites are worse in hot and dry weather. Warmer summers, of course, are going to drive them up. We also know for wheat and other broadacre crops that stripe rust is a very problematic pressure on us, and warmer winter temperatures that will increase its impacts greatly. One of the things we don't know much about, though, is soil-borne pathogens. We have done some research. We know what some of them are, but we don't know what that looks like in a changing climate as we move into the future. So some broad background kind of things that I think are important from adaptive kind of capacity areas. Growers and producers in every agribusinesses undergo changes in how they react to weather and climate all the time, but they don't do it in isolation. And this is a very important piece of what agribusiness is all about. Growers and producers are operating in multi-risk environments, and they have to consider everything, how all of these individual aspects of climate, their regional to national to international markets, and then the policy implications that are put in place on them within their environment. So the status of the ability to adapt will really determine future vulnerabilities. The gradual nature, though, of climate change should allow, especially for annual crop systems, the ability to adapt. Perennial crop systems a little bit different. You have to plan for it because you're looking at a long-lived crop system that you put in the ground and you're expecting 50 years out of it. So we really have to think about what those adaptation strategies are depending on the type of crop you're working with. And then lastly, this is one of the big ones. I think that partially being aware of the problem is part of the issue, but we need to be able to conduct the right kinds of research in the regions that we're talking about, especially ours, and do the kind of innovation and technology transfers that allows people in agribusinesses to make the kind of changes that will help them out. What can growers and producers do? We've heard this a little bit from the previous speakers as well. I think sequestering carbon in both biomass and soils is extremely important at the local level. Increasing low-till and or no-till farming practices, of course, can help. Changing the efficiency and or use of inputs such as fuel, fertilizer, pesticides, herbicides, so on and so forth. Increase the production and usage of agricultural biofuels on site so you can use your own leftovers to, so to speak, run your farm. Improve nitrogen use efficiency so we can decrease nitrous oxide emissions. And then, of course, work with capturing methane as best we can from composting and animal manure storage. What can policy do? Eric talked about this a little bit, and I think this is a huge piece of it. Water will be our issue in the future. If we realize the projections that are out for us right now, we need to clearly prepare for water shortages for both us and agriculture. And the demands that society will put on it will determine kind of how agriculture is able to adapt around this. We can fight over a smaller pie of water when it's needed the most, or we can be innovative and study, design, and implement capture systems. We are so far behind the gun on this. Australia, South Africa, other countries where they're already impacted by drought are really much ahead of this game. And we need to look at that as a way for us to kind of move forward. We also need to attempt to divide up the pie such that we don't create more conflict. If we continually divide up this pie to the point that there's very little left over, it's just going to be a mess. So building a large, more innovative pie for water creates opportunities for all of us to collaborate and benefit, I think, and we need to definitely get there. Last piece of this is for consumers, and I think this all makes total sense overall. We need to become, as consumers, you're sitting here doing it right now, becoming more aware of global to local agricultural production and economic structures. We need to know how that all works. If you don't know how it works, you can't really know what's happening in your grocery store and on your dinner table. We also need to become more familiar with global to local impacts of how climate change impacts agriculture. Talking about it here today and listening to others, I think will help very much. We also need to buy local to mitigate and reduce impacts. The more you can do that, the better off you are. We also need to buy in season as much as possible. Do you need a watermelon in January? I mean, is a real question. If we don't buy it, it will not come. I mean, that's kind of the basic issue. So we have to think about that overall. We also need to support local growers and producers regardless of cost. This is very important. The reason is that what you find from local producers at a given cost is likely a livable wage. They're not trying to make a ton of money off you. They're trying to make a livable wage. And so we need to pay for that price. And so it's very important for us to keep aware of that. The other piece of this that we need to be aware of too is if climates are changing the way they are and producers in the region need to change the way they produce, then you need to be flexible as products change to be able to buy what works there. I mean, we've done that throughout history. There's no reason we can't do that in the future. So that's it for me today. I really thank you for being engaged in this process. Thank you.